My mother said I had soft hands. She didn't mean it as a compliment. She said it the way you'd say someone had weak eyes or flat feet, like it was a flaw she had noticed early and quietly accepted as her burden. My sister Diane had sharp hands, efficient hands, hands that could assemble a model kit at 9 years old without losing a single piece. My mother watched Diane the way people watch someone they're proud of from across a crowded room, steady with a small smile, like she already knew how the story was going to end. I was the one she had to figure out. We grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house that smelled like dryer sheets, and my mother's ambitions for Diane. That sounds cruel, and maybe it is. But I've had a long time to sit with it, and I've stopped softening the edges just to make the memory more comfortable. Diane was 2 years older than me, and she was the kind of kid teachers remembered. Not because she was loud, Diane was never loud, but because she was precise. She answered questions before they were fully asked. She read ahead in the textbook. By the time she was 12, my mother had her enrolled in a Saturday enrichment program at the University of Dayton. And on those mornings, I stayed home with my father, who would make us both scrambled eggs and let me watch whatever I wanted on TV. I didn't know those Saturday mornings were going to be the most peaceful of my childhood. I didn't know I was supposed to be cataloging them. I liked making things, not building things the way Diane did. Structured, logical things. I liked making things that didn't have to be anything specific. I would take paper bags from the grocery store and cut them into pieces and glue them together into shapes that my father would tape to the refrigerator without asking me what they were. He never asked what they were. I think he understood that asking would have made it smaller. My mother asked once. I told her it was a bird. She looked at it for a long moment and said, "It doesn't look like a bird." She wasn't wrong. It didn't look like a bird. It looked like what I felt when I thought about birds. The looseness, the lift, the going somewhere else. But I was 8 years old and I didn't have the words for that, so I just said, "I know," and took it down from the refrigerator myself. That was the first time I understood that my mother and I were not going to understand each other. By the time I was in middle school, the difference between Diane and me had become the organizing principle of our household. Diane won a regional science competition in 6th grade, and my mother framed a certificate and hung it in the hallway where you could see it from the front door. When I got an A in art class that same year, my mother said, "That's nice, but art isn't going to pay your rent." I was 11. I didn't think about rent yet. I was thinking about the self-portrait I'd made with watercolors, how I'd figured out how to make the shadow under my chin look real just by using more water and less paint. But I smiled and said okay, and I went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my hands. Soft hands. In high school, I started keeping a sketchbook that I hid under my mattress. Not because I was ashamed of it. I wasn't exactly, but because I had learned that showing my work to my mother meant receiving a verdict, and I wasn't ready for verdicts. I drew the neighborhood from memory. I drew my father's hands, which were actually soft, and I loved them. I drew Diane the way I saw her, organized, capable, already somewhere I couldn't follow. Diane got into Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship. The night she opened the letter, my mother made her favorite dinner, pot roast with rosemary potatoes, and called both sets of grandparents to tell them. It was a celebration, and it should have been. Diane had worked for it. I sat at the table and ate pot roast and was genuinely happy for my sister, because that's the thing nobody tells you about being the less favored child. You don't stop loving the person who got more. You just learn to feel two things at once. My mother gave a little speech at the table. She talked about hard work and perseverance and how proud she was. She looked at Diane the entire time. When I got into the graphic design program at Columbus College of Art and Design 2 years later, I showed my mother the acceptance letter on a Tuesday evening while she was folding laundry. She looked at it. She handed it back. She said, "Is that the kind of degree that leads somewhere?" I said I thought so. She said, "Well, we'll see." That was the closest I got to a congratulations. My father hugged me in the kitchen later that night, quietly, when my mother had already gone upstairs. He held on for a few seconds longer than usual. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. College was the first time I understood what it felt like to be in the right room. Not the top of the room, not the best in the class, not the most technically gifted, but the right room, where the language everyone spoke was the same one I'd been trying to speak my entire life. My professors gave feedback that was hard and honest and didn't feel like verdicts. They asked what I was trying to do before they told me whether I'd done it. I called my father every Sunday. I called my mother less often, and the calls were short. How are your grades? Are you eating enough? Your sister says hello. I always said everything was fine. It usually was. My aunt on my father's side, a woman named June who had spent 30 years teaching high school English in Cincinnati, sent me a card every semester. Inside the card, she always wrote the same question. Did you understand more this week than last week? Not, did you get good grades? Not, are you keeping up? Just, do you understand more? I taped every card to the inside of my closet door in my dorm room, and I looked at them when I was struggling, and somehow they were always enough. After graduation, I moved to Columbus and got a job at a small design studio that did work for regional nonprofits and small businesses. The pay was modest. My apartment was a one-bedroom on the second floor of an older building near Clintonville, and it had good light in the afternoons and a neighbor named Gloria who was in her 70s and grew tomatoes on her balcony and sometimes knocked on my door to give me a bag of them when they came in too fast. I was happy. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet, ordinary way that I think is actually the harder thing to hold on to. My mother called me that first year, maybe once a month. She told me about Diane's job at an engineering consulting firm in Cincinnati. She told me about Diane's new apartment, Diane's promotion, Diane's boyfriend who had a good job and came from a good family. She didn't ask much about me. When I told her about a project I was proud of, a brand identity I developed for a food bank that ended up getting picked up by a local news feature, she said, "That's sweet. Sweet." I was 24 years old, and my work had just been called sweet, and I held the phone and looked at the good afternoon light in my apartment and made myself not say what I was thinking. The next year, I met someone. His name was James. He was a high school history teacher, funny in a way that crept up on you. And he had a family that ate dinner together on Sundays and argued about baseball and hugged each other goodbye every single time, even when they'd only been together for an hour. The first time his mother hugged me, I didn't know what to do with my arms. It had been a long time since someone's mother had touched me like I was worth holding. James's family didn't make a big deal about what anyone did for work. His sister was a nurse, his brother was a line cook, his father had spent 30 years doing maintenance at a regional airport. Nobody's job was the measure of their worth at that table. I didn't know that was something I had been missing until I was sitting in the middle of it. I told James about my mother slowly, the way you tell someone about an old injury. Not because it's dramatic, but because it explains why you flinch sometimes when they don't expect it. He listened without fixing anything. He just said, "That sounds really lonely," and something in my chest loosened that I hadn't known was tight. When I was 27, I got a freelance commission from a regional arts organization in Columbus to design the visual identity for a new community gallery space. It was the biggest project I'd ever taken on independently, and I worked on it for 4 months, and when the gallery opened, my work was literally on the walls, the logo, the signage, the program materials. James came. My Aunt June drove up from Cincinnati. 2 of my closest friends from the studio were there. Gloria from downstairs came and wore her good coat and told me she always knew I had something. My mother did not come. She said she had a prior commitment. I didn't ask what it was. What I didn't know, and wouldn't find out until 3 months later, was that during that same period, my mother had been telling people, family friends, extended relatives, people from her church, that I was still finding my way, that I was doing little projects, that she wasn't sure when I would settle into something real. I found out because a cousin on my mother's side mentioned it at a family gathering I attended with my father. She said it gently, the way people do when they think they're helping. "Your mom talks about you, you know. She worries." And then she told me piece by piece what my mother had been saying. I sat with it for a week before I did anything. I want to be clear about something. I'm not a person who performs anger well. I don't raise my voice. I don't send long accusatory texts. I'm not built that way. But I am a person who documents because I'm a designer and documentation is how I think. So I made a document, a quiet, factual document, A timeline of the last 3 years, the gallery project, the news feature, the clients, the work, dates, names, outcomes, links. Not a manifesto, not an accusation. Just evidence that I existed and was working, and was not, in fact, still finding my way. I sent it to my mother in an email with 3 sentences. I heard what you've been telling people. I thought you might want to see what I've actually been doing. I'd like to talk when you're ready. She did not respond to the email. My sister called me 2 days later. Diane, to her credit, called me herself rather than making someone else do it. But what she said was, "Mom is really hurt that you sent that. This is a family matter and you shouldn't have documented it like that." It made her feel accused. I said, "I didn't accuse her of anything. I sent her facts." Diane said, "You know how she is?" I did know how she was. That was exactly the problem. I said, "Diane, she has been telling people I'm nothing for 3 years. Did you know that?" Diane was quiet. Then she said, "She just doesn't know how to talk about what you do." I said, "Then she could say nothing." Diane said she thought I needed to be more understanding of where our mother came from and the pressure she'd been under raising 2 daughters, and she just wanted us to be close. I listened to all of it. I let her finish. And then I said as calmly as I could manage, "I'm not angry at you, but I'm not going to call Mom and apologize for showing her the truth." Diane sighed. She said I was being rigid. She said family was complicated. I said I agreed that family was complicated and I loved her and I would talk to her soon. Then I hung up and sat on my kitchen floor for a while, which is something I do when I need to think and I don't want the furniture involved. James found me there. He came in from the other room and sat down on the floor next to me without asking why I was there. After a while, he said, "Do you want to talk about it, or do you want me to make tea?" I said tea. He made tea. He sat next to me. We didn't say much. That was how I knew I had built the right life. For 2 years, things were quiet on that front. I didn't call my mother. She didn't call me. I sent a card at Christmas. She sent one back. A generic one, the kind you buy in a box of 20. And signed it with just her name. No message. I was okay. Not perfectly okay. Not every day. There were moments. A Sunday when James's mother called just to check in. A morning when I walked past a mother and daughter in a coffee shop who were laughing together about something I couldn't hear. When the grief came up clean and sharp. And I just had to let it move through me. My Aunt June called every few weeks. She never pushed me to reconcile. She never told me what my mother said about me to her, though I suspected she heard things. She just asked every single time, "Did you understand more this week than last week?" And I did. Every week, I understood a little more. When I was 29, I got a call from an independent publisher based in Columbus who had seen my gallery work. They wanted me to lead the visual redesign of their entire imprint. New covers, new brand language, new identity. It was the largest contract I had ever signed. It changed things, financially and professionally, in ways I was still getting used to. James and I had gotten engaged the previous spring. Quietly, at home, with no performance and no social media announcement, because that's who we were. We were planning a wedding for the following year. Small, 40 people. The people who had actually shown up. My mother reached out 2 months after the publisher contract was announced. Not through me, through my father, who called and said carefully that my mother wanted to know if there was a chance to talk. My father is a good man. He is also a man who spent 30 years trying to manage my mother's moods without ever confronting them directly. And I love him and I understand him. And I have also, over the years, had to make peace with his particular kind of cowardice. He didn't protect me when I was young. He made eggs on Saturday mornings and hugged me quietly in kitchens, and that was the most he could do. And I've had to decide whether that's enough. I've decided it's enough. Not because it doesn't still hurt sometimes, but because I can't spend the rest of my life penalizing someone for the limits of their courage. I told my father I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 weeks. Then I called James's mother. Not for advice exactly, but because she's the kind of person who listens without needing you to arrive at her preferred conclusion. I told her the whole thing. She was quiet through most of it. At the end, she said, "What do you actually need from this? Not what's fair, not what she owes you. What do you need?" I thought about that for a long time. I called my mother back. We met at a coffee shop in Dayton, neutral ground. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug, and I noticed that she looked older than I'd expected, though it had only been 2 years. She had the look of someone who had been carrying something. We sat with pleasantries for a few minutes. The drive, the weather, how the coffee was. And then I said, because I have learned that I am not good at waiting, I want to understand what happened, not to have a fight. I want to understand. She looked at her mug. She said, I didn't know how to be proud of something I didn't understand. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard her say. I let it sit there. I didn't rush to fill the silence. Then I said, you could have told me that. She said, I know. And then quietly, I didn't know that was what I was doing. I believe she believed that. I also know it doesn't change what it felt like. We talked for almost 2 hours. I told her things I'd never told her. About hiding the sketchbook, about what it felt like when she handed the acceptance letter back and asked if it led somewhere, about the Sunday morning she didn't come to the gallery. I didn't say these things as accusations. I said them as information. Things that had happened inside me that she hadn't been able to see. She cried once, briefly, and then collected herself in the way she always does. She did not apologize in the way I had once needed her to. She didn't say I was wrong. I'm sorry, I failed you. But she said something I hadn't expected. I'm glad you built what you did. I'm glad you didn't let me stop you. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in front of her building for 20 minutes. Not crying, just sitting, processing. James was waiting inside. He had made dinner, not because I asked him to, but because he's the kind of person who knows what I need before I say it. I came in and sat at the table and told him everything she'd said, and he listened, and when I was done, he said, How do you feel? I said, like something finished? He nodded like he understood. We are not close, my mother and I. Not the way I once let myself imagine we might be. We text on birthdays. I called her when my father had a minor health scare last fall, and she sounded genuinely grateful, like she hadn't been sure I would. Diane and I have found our way back to something that works. Less close than childhood, more honest than before. She called me 2 months ago to tell me she was pregnant, and I meant it when I said I was happy. The wedding was on a Saturday in October, in Columbus, at a small venue with big windows that let in the afternoon light. 41 people. James's whole family. My father, who walked me down the aisle and cried and didn't apologize for it. My Aunt June, who sat in the front row and squeezed my hand before the ceremony started and didn't ask me anything at all, just looked at me and nodded like she already had her answer. My mother was not there. That was my decision, and I made it without rage and without needing anyone to agree with it. Some doors you close not because you hate what's on the other side, but because you finally stop waiting for someone to come through them. Gloria from upstairs sent flowers. A big, unsettled bouquet of sunflowers that arrived that morning and sat in the corner of the bridal room and made everyone laugh. At the reception, James's mother gave a toast. She talked about what it meant to choose your family deliberately. Not to replace the family you came from, but to build something alongside it that holds you the way you need to be held. She talked about James, but she looked at me when she said the part about building something from scratch. And I knew she was also talking about the studio in Columbus and the gallery walls, and the publisher and the sketchbooks under the mattress, and all the years I spent making things that didn't look like what they were to anyone but me. I looked around the room. James, his family, my father, slightly rumpled in his rented suit, my Aunt June, who had driven 2 hours and would drive 2 hours back and never once asked for anything in return. My 2 oldest friends from the studio, the ones who had shown up with wine when I sat on my kitchen floor. The ones who texted back every single time. Gloria in the back row with good earrings and a look on her face like she was personally responsible for all of this. I thought about what I was going to say when the toast came around to me. I kept it short. I said, I spent a long time thinking family was something that happened to you. I'm grateful every day that I was wrong. These are my people, not because of a name, not because of obligation. Not because I didn't have another choice, because they stayed, because they showed up, because they looked at the thing I made and didn't ask what it was supposed to be. They just taped it to the refrigerator and let it be whatever it was. That's enough. That has always been enough. I used to think the hardest part of my story was what my mother did. Now I think the hardest part was learning that she didn't do it out of hatred. She did it out of a limitation she never bothered to examine. And there's something almost more difficult about forgiving that. A wound with no villain, just a person who couldn't stretch far enough to reach you. What I've come to understand, slowly and without anyone handing me the answer, is that the way we treat people accumulates. Every small dismissal, every handed back letter, every dinner celebration that didn't include your name. Those things don't disappear, they settle. They shape the way a child learns to take up space in the world or shrink from it. My mother never raised her hand to me. She never screamed. But she handed me back my acceptance letter and asked if it led somewhere, and I carried that question in my chest for years like a splinter I couldn't find the edge of. And here's the thing about accumulation. It works in both directions. Every Sunday call with my Aunt June. Every card that asked not whether I was succeeding, but whether I was understanding more. Every morning, James sat on the kitchen floor next to me without needing to know why. Every bag of tomatoes from Gloria. Every friend who texted back. Those things accumulated too. They built something underneath me I didn't even notice until the moment I needed to stand on it, and it held. I think about that when I think about what it means to live with integrity. Not integrity in the formal, glossy sense, but the quieter kind. The kind that means you keep showing up to your own life even when nobody in your original family is watching. The kind that means you document the truth not to punish anyone, but because you are a person who exists and your existence deserves a record. The kind that means you sit across from the woman who hurt you and you tell her the truth, not with rage, but with clarity, because you've done the work of knowing the difference. Intelligence, I've learned, is not what my mother thought it was. It's not a test score or scholarship or a job title that impresses people at dinner parties. It's the capacity to keep learning about your craft, about other people, about the specific and unrepeatable shape of your own interior life. My Aunt June knew that. She asked me the same question for 15 years, because she understood that understanding is not a destination, it's a practice. I want to be the kind of person who keeps practicing. And courage? Real courage is not the dramatic kind. It's not the confrontation, though sometimes that's part of it. It's the 1,000 small decisions to keep building something real when someone you love has told you in 100 quiet ways that what you're building doesn't count. It's going back to the sketchbook. It's sending the email. It's driving to the coffee shop and sitting down across from someone who hurt you and deciding that your own clarity matters more than their comfort. I don't know what my mother does with the version of events that lives in her head. I've stopped needing to know. What I know is this. 41 people sat in a room with big afternoon windows and chose to be there. James's mother gave a toast about building family on purpose. My father cried in a rented suit. June drove 2 hours each way and asked me nothing because she already knew. The life I have is not the one anyone planned for me. It is entirely, stubbornly, quietly the one I built. And that, I think, is the whole point.